In the autumn of 1943, the Crimean Peninsula was no longer only a geographical term on staff maps, but a closed pocket in the making. The narrow Perekop Isthmus between the Black Sea and the Sivash lagoons formed the main land bridge to the Ukrainian mainland, historically fortified and now held by German and Romanian troops of the 17th Army. Behind them lay ports, airfields and road nets that had supported offensive operations toward the Caucasus in 1942. Ahead of them, across the Dnieper and the steppe, the Red Army was approaching from several directions, reshaping the strategic meaning of every bridge, causeway and trench line that connected Crimea to the rest of the front. Germany's hold on Crimea dated to 1941 to 1942, when the 11th Army captured the peninsula and seized Sevastopol after months of siege. The region then became a base for Luftwaffe formations and Kriegsmarine and Romanian naval units operating in the Black Sea, supporting operations against Soviet ports and sea communications. For Berlin and Bucharest, Crimean airfields offered positions from which bombers could reach the Caucasus oil region and, potentially, targets near the straits. For the Soviet leadership, loss of the peninsula threatened coastal shipping, access to the Caucasus, and the psychological impact of a hostile bridgehead deep in the Black Sea. After the defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, the wider situation around the Black Sea shifted. The German 17th Army, reconstituted as a predominantly defensive force, held the Kuban bridgehead on the Taman Peninsula through spring and summer 1943, covering the withdrawal from the Caucasus and shielding the approaches to Crimea. Soviet forces of the North Caucasus Front pressed against this foothold, while further north, other Soviet fronts were driving German formations back toward the Dnieper line. Maintaining the Kuban position demanded shipping capacity, air cover, and reserves that Berlin increasingly needed elsewhere. On September 4, 1943, Adolf Hitler finally authorized Generaloberst Erwin Jänecke's 17th Army to evacuate the Kuban bridgehead and retreat across the Kerch Strait into Crimea. The transfer brought German and Romanian divisions, including 5th Army Corps, 49th Mountain Corps, and the Romanian Mountain Corps, into an already strained peninsula. By early 1944, the 17th Army in Crimea would number about 230,000 personnel, of whom a significant portion were Romanian troops and support services. The concentration of these forces increased the local defensive potential, but also raised the scale of any future supply and evacuation problem. For German decision-makers, Crimea's continued occupation served several purposes. The peninsula was seen as a shield for the Romanian oil fields at Ploiesti against Soviet air attack, since Soviet aviation operating from Crimean bases would shorten routes to the Balkans. It also had a political dimension. Abandonment of Crimea was expected to negatively influence Turkish perceptions of German strength in the Black Sea region. Moreover, the peninsula had been presented in German propaganda as a symbol of earlier victories. These factors encouraged Hitler to treat Crimea as a territory to be held to the last, rather than as a position to be traded for maneuver space. Soviet planners viewed the same terrain through the lens of their 1943 to 1944 successive blows strategy. After forcing German withdrawals from the Caucasus and the Taman Peninsula, the Stavka aimed to liberate the lower Dnieper, isolate Crimea, and then eliminate the 17th Army. To this end, the North Caucasus Front, and later the 4th Ukrainian Front, prepared amphibious and land operations that would bypass or penetrate the coastal defences. Orders issued in October 1943 directed preparations for landings on the Kerch Peninsula, intended to create bridgeheads for a later offensive into the interior of Crimea. Crimea's internal situation reflected these strategic pressures. Pre-war population levels had already been reduced by evacuation, mobilization, and earlier fighting. Remaining Soviet civilians, German military administrations, Romanian units, local collaborators, and various ethnic communities, including Crimean Tatars, lived under strict security regulations, rationing, and labor demands. The arrival of formations withdrawn from Kuban, along with their dependents and service troops, intensified competition for housing, supplies, and transport capacity. Ports such as Sevastopol, Feodosia, and Kerch became crucial nodes for bringing in fuel, ammunition, and food from the western Black Sea, while also moving wounded and specialists out. Geography constrained every operational plan. The Perekop Isthmus, roughly 8 to 10 kilometers wide, had been fortified by the Soviet Union before 1941 with trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank ditches. After occupying the area, German engineers incorporated parts of these works into their own defensive system, while also constructing field positions along the Siva shoreline and the narrow Arabat Spit. As the Red Army advanced through southern Ukraine in late 1943, German staff officers examined options for either using these fortifications as a barrier for a prolonged stand or for covering a staged withdrawal. In both cases, the condition of bridges, causeways, and prepared positions at Perekop would be decisive for any future movement of heavy equipment and rear services. By November 1943, Soviet land operations north of Crimea and the forthcoming Kerch-Eltigen amphibious assault were about to test these choices. The peninsula was turning from an advanced base into an isolated stronghold. The same engineering works that promised to delay Soviet pursuit across the isthmus also defined, and potentially limited, the only direct land route by which the 17th Army and its allies could ever leave Crimea again. The opening phase of the crisis around Perekop unfolded in parallel on two different maps. One stretched across southern Ukraine, the other condensed into the narrow neck of land leading into Crimea. In October 1943, Soviet fronts broke through the German positions along the lower Dnieper. The 4th Ukrainian Front and parts of the 3rd Ukrainian Front forced crossings near Zaporozhye, Dnepropetrovsk, and Nikopol, while further south Soviet troops approached Melitopol. German 6th Army and elements of the 1st Panzer Army were compelled to withdraw westward under growing pressure, giving up ground that had shielded the northern approaches to the peninsula. For Army Group A, responsible for the southern sector, the changing front line created a dilemma. On paper, Crimea was still connected to the mainland through Perekop, the Chongar crossings, and the Arabat Spit. In practice, Soviet advances threatened to cut these links by turning them from rear zones into front sectors. Staff officers in Army and Corps headquarters began to recalculate distances between Soviet spearheads and the isthmus, to estimate how long rail and road movements into Crimea would remain possible, and to determine how much heavy equipment and supply stock could still be moved out if a retreat were ordered. The German 17th Army, concentrated on the peninsula after the Kuban evacuation, watched these developments with particular attention. Its commander, General Oberst Janicke, received regular reports from neighboring formations about Soviet progress. These messages indicated that, within weeks, Perekop might change from a sheltered rear area into the main barrier between Soviet forces and the Crimean interior. Army engineers and fortress troops inspected the pre-existing trench systems, bunkers, and fieldworks at the isthmus, many of them originally built by the Red Army before 1941. They evaluated which positions could be integrated into a new defensive line, and which might, under certain circumstances, have to be blown up to prevent their use by an attacker. On the Soviet side, Stavka and the command of the 4th Ukrainian Front tried to synchronize operations north of Crimea with amphibious plans in the Kerch Strait. Directives issued in October and early November ordered the creation of bridgeheads, both at Perekop and across the Sivash, while also preparing landings on the Kerch Peninsula. The intention was clear: to prevent the Germans from establishing a stable defensive line by forcing them to split attention between several axes. Reconnaissance units, partisan groups, and air reconnaissance monitored traffic on the narrow roads and railways leading to the peninsula, reporting convoys of vehicles, artillery, and construction materials moving toward Perekop. As Soviet formations approached the lower Dnieper near Kherson and the Black Sea coast, German rear services began evacuating depots and workshops located north of Perekop. Fuel stocks, ammunition, and certain categories of technical equipment were transferred into Crimea. Civilians connected with German military administration, as well as families of some local collaborators, were offered places on columns heading south. These movements increased congestion on the main road and rail line across the isthmus. From the perspective of individual drivers and soldiers in these convoys, Perekop appeared less as a fortress and more as a bottleneck where every delay risked entrapment. By early November, as Soviet forces established bridgeheads on the western bank of the lower Dnieper, field reports reached German headquarters warning that a rapid Soviet advance toward the peninsula could not be excluded. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, engineer units received instructions to prepare demolition charges on bridges, culverts, and selected fortification elements around the isthmus. The immediate purpose was straightforward: to ensure that once German units had passed through, they could delay or channel any Soviet pursuit. At the same time, these preparations raised internal concerns. Some staff officers pointed out that destroying the most developed positions and key infrastructure at Perekop would also remove options for a later controlled withdrawal out of Crimea if higher command eventually decided to abandon the peninsula. For Soviet planners, none of these internal debates were visible in detail. What they saw, through captured documents and interrogations of prisoners, was evidence of German intent to hold Crimea and to convert Perekop into a barrier rather than an escape route. Intelligence summaries noted explosions, destroyed road segments, and the systematic removal of rail installations on the northern approaches. To Soviet troops advancing across the steppe, the isthmus and its fortifications appeared as an obstacle zone that would require careful preparation, artillery support, and engineer resources to overcome, whether in late 1943 or in a future offensive. In November 1943, therefore, the initial phase of the Crimean bridge problem took shape not in a single dramatic event, but in a series of overlapping movements and technical decisions. Each demolished trench line or bridge section at Perekop increased the distance that Soviet units would have to cover on foot or across improvised crossings. At the same time, each destruction narrowed the options for any later large-scale German retreat by land. The opening moves of the campaign fixed the isthmus as both shield and potential trap, even before the first major assault against it had begun. Strategic planning for Crimea in late 1943 revolved around a central question for the German command. Should the peninsula be treated as a forward bastion to be held at all costs, or as a heavy grouping that had to be preserved for later operations elsewhere? At the operational level, the 17th Army Staff, examining maps and supply tables, leaned toward a flexible solution. They considered using Perekop and the Sivash as a screening line, withdrawing step by step if the mainland situation deteriorated, and, if required, evacuating major units by land and sea. At the political and strategic level in Berlin, however, Crimea featured in broader calculations that tended to freeze the military situation rather than adapt it. Hitler's objectives combined military utility with political symbolism. Crimea protected, in his view, the oil fields of Romania by keeping Soviet air bases away from the western Black Sea. Airfields around Sevastopol, Simferopol, and Saki were seen as key for Luftwaffe operations over the sea lanes and the Caucasus. At the same time, abandoning the peninsula was judged likely to weaken Axis prestige among allies such as Romania and Hungary, and to influence Turkey's interpretation of the regional balance. These considerations led to repeated refusals to authorize any planning assumption that envisaged complete evacuation. Orders stressed that the 17th Army was to defend Crimea as a fortified region, not as a temporary bridgehead. Within this framework, German engineers and logisticians tried to reconcile contradictory tasks. They were required to strengthen fortifications on the Perekop Isthmus, the Chonga crossings, and along the Sivash, while simultaneously preparing demolition plans for bridges, road junctions, and parts of the old Soviet defensive lines. The official rationale was to ensure freedom of maneuver during local retreats and to deny the use of key positions to the Red Army. In staff conferences, however, it was clear that blowing up complete belts of fieldworks at Perekop would not only slow an enemy, but would also permanently reduce the capacity of this narrow corridor to carry heavy traffic if a large-scale withdrawal from Crimea were later ordered. Supply planning highlighted the same tension. Before the Soviet advance to the lower Dnieper, the 17th Army's logistical concept rested on a combination of rail and road traffic via Perekop and sea transport from Romanian and Bulgarian ports. As Soviet troops approached Kherson and the Black Sea littoral, the land component of this system became increasingly fragile. Quartermaster reports showed growing dependence on shipping from Constanta and other western Black Sea ports to Sevastopol, Feodosia, and Yevpatoria. Each convoy brought fuel, ammunition, and food for more than 200,000 troops and tens of thousands of horses and vehicles, but each convoy also competed with other theatres for scarce shipping and escorts. German naval and air staffs assessed the risk of keeping such a large force supplied almost exclusively by sea. Soviet submarines already operated in sections of the Black Sea, and air units from the Caucasus and the Taman area could strike at ports and shipping routes. Weather in winter months further complicated the picture, as storms and ice could disrupt schedules. Despite these concerns, the High Command judged that sea supply, while difficult, remained possible. This assessment underpinned the decision to continue fortifying Crimea and preparing local demolitions at Perekop, rather than prioritizing the preservation of intact exit routes. On the Soviet side, Stavka's strategic goals were clearer: to isolate and ultimately destroy the 17th Army. The liberation of the lower Dnieper and southern Ukraine was designed not only to push the front westward, but also to cut the land connection to Crimea. Operational directives for the 4th Ukrainian Front and the North Caucasus Front specified 3 parallel lines of effort: pressure along the Dnieper toward Kherson and Nikolaev, exploitation of crossings over the Sivash, and amphibious operations across the Kerch Strait. The intention was to create a converging threat that would leave the Axis forces with no safe large-capacity exit from the peninsula. Soviet logistics and engineering planning reflected lessons from earlier operations. The Kerch-Eltigen landings planned for November 1943 required assembling landing craft, barges, and small vessels in ports along the eastern Azov and the Taman area, organizing supply echelons and coordinating with Black Sea Fleet units. For operations against Perekop and the Sivash, engineer battalions prepared bridging equipment, assault boats, and mine-clearing detachments. Intelligence summaries attempted to estimate German troop strength in Crimea, by late 1943, assessed in the range of several 100,000, and to map likely defensive belts around Perekop and the northern shores of the peninsula. Propaganda on both sides simplified these complex calculations for wider audiences. German radio and press described Crimea as an unsinkable stronghold, controlling the Black Sea, emphasizing the endurance of its garrison and the strength of its fortifications. Soviet media presented the peninsula as occupied Soviet territory that would inevitably be liberated as part of the broader offensive across Ukraine. Neither narrative dwelt on the technical question that preoccupied staffs: whether the same fortifications that supposedly guaranteed the security of Crimea might, if combined with systematic demolitions at Perekop, convert the peninsula into a position that could no longer be vacated in an orderly way. By the end of 1943, therefore, both sides had set their strategic frameworks. German planning treated Perekop primarily as a defensive barrier whose structures could be destroyed to delay pursuit, assuming that sea communications would sustain the 17th Army and, if necessary, handle controlled evacuations. Soviet planning treated the same corridor as one of several access routes into Crimea. Even if its fortifications and bridges were demolished, attacks across the Sivash and from Kerch were expected to compensate. In this interplay of assumptions, the demolition preparations at Perekop were recorded in engineering files as routine defensive measures, but they were already shaping the options that would be available months later when the question of escape from Crimea became urgent. The first direct clashes over access to Crimea began in the air and at sea before the main land approach at Perekop came under sustained attack. In the night of 31st October to 1st November 1943, Soviet forces launched the Kerch-Eltigen amphibious operation. Elements of the 56th Army and 18th Army, supported by the Black Sea Fleet and Azov Flotilla, crossed the Kerch Strait in small craft and barges. Two principal landing areas were selected, one near Eltigen on the southeastern shore of the Kerch Peninsula, another closer to the city of Kerch itself. The initial landings brought across several thousand troops with light weapons, mortars and limited artillery, establishing footholds on beaches under fire from German coastal batteries and field positions. For the 17th Army, these landings confirmed that Crimea could be attacked from multiple directions. German and Romanian units stationed on the Kerch Peninsula, including elements of infantry and mountain divisions, moved to contain the bridgeheads. Fighting developed into a series of local engagements along low hills, ravines, and villages. Soviet assault groups attempted to expand their perimeter, secure local roads, and capture German gun positions, while German counterattacks used artillery, close air support, and armoured vehicles brought forward from inland depots. The Kerch landings did not immediately threaten Perekop, but they forced the 17th Army to commit reserves that might otherwise have been used to strengthen the isthmus. Almost simultaneously, on the northern approaches to Crimea, the 4th Ukrainian Front intensified pressure along the Sivash and toward Perekop. Soviet reconnaissance units probed German outposts on the narrow causeways and along the marshy shores, identifying minefields, wire obstacles, and artillery positions. Engineer detachments measured water depths and current patterns in preparation for crossing operations. The first serious attempts to create bridgeheads across the Sivash began in early November, when Soviet assault groups in boats and on improvised rafts moved toward the low, muddy banks held by elements of German infantry and security units. These early engagements had immediate technical consequences. German engineers, acting on pre-arranged orders, detonated charges on selected bunkers, trench sections, and smaller bridges in forward zones that had to be abandoned. The purpose was to hinder Soviet consolidation on any ground temporarily given up. Demolitions included not only purely military objects, but also culverts under roads, auxiliary piers, and segments of field railways. On the maps of engineer staffs, these actions were recorded as standard withdrawals in contact. For the units on the ground, however, each explosion reduced the number of prepared positions to which they could retreat in an orderly sequence. Soviet troops experiencing these actions confronted a transformed terrain. Instead of continuous belts of enemy fieldworks that might be captured and reused, assault units often found shattered trench lines partially flooded, with collapsed dugouts and broken wire obstacles scattered irregularly. Crossing attempts over the Sivash had to contend with demolished piers and burned boats on the German side, forcing Soviet engineers to construct their own pontoons and footbridges under fire. Failures of early crossings, including men lost in the mud and shallow water, revealed how effectively demolitions and terrain could combine to slow an advance, even when German infantry strength was limited. Civilians in the northern Crimean districts and in the steppe regions south of the Dnieper observed these first clashes from varying distances. Those living near railway junctions and depots saw columns of German and Romanian units moving south, mixed with construction troops and supply trains. Occasional Soviet air raids on stations and road intersections underlined that the routes leading to Perekop were already within reach of enemy aviation. Local labourers were employed in repairing damaged tracks and loading materials bound for the peninsula, while at the same time hearing reports that fortifications at the isthmus itself were being altered or destroyed. Morale among German and Romanian frontline soldiers reflected this ambiguous situation. On the Kerch Peninsula, units engaged against the Soviet bridgeheads saw that the enemy was prepared to accept high losses to secure a presence on Crimea's eastern shore, indicating that future offensives could come from that direction regardless of what happened at Perekop. At the northern edge of the peninsula, troops manning positions near the isthmus and Sivash had to adjust to a defensive concept in which their own engineers were progressively removing parts of the very infrastructure that had previously been presented as a security guarantee. For Soviet commanders, the first phase of clashes around Kerch and the northern approaches was assessed in terms of foothold versus attrition. The Kerch bridgeheads, although costly to sustain and limited in depth, offered a permanent threat to the eastern sector of the 17th Army. The incomplete bridgeheads across the Sivash and the probing actions near Perekop demonstrated that German defences could be reached but not yet decisively broken. Reports from these early engagements emphasized the extent of German demolitions and the difficulty of transporting heavy weapons over destroyed or flooded terrain. By the end of 1943, the opening confrontations around Crimea had thus produced a complex picture. The Wehrmacht still held the peninsula, had contained the Kerch landings to relatively small areas, and maintained its main line at Perekop and the Sivash. At the same time, the combination of Soviet footholds on the Kerch Peninsula, Soviet bridgeheads across the Dnieper and parts of the Sivash, and the ongoing demolition of forward defensive works and transport links at the isthmus began to erode the practical value of Perekop as a fully functional escape route. The first clashes had not yet decided the campaign, but they had already altered the physical and operational landscape on which later decisions about retreat or continued defence would have to be made. Through the winter of 1943 to 1944, the confrontation over Crimea entered a phase of escalation in which time and logistics became as decisive as artillery and infantry. The Kerch bridgeheads, the Sivash crossings, and the Perekop area turned into interconnected pressure points. Each new Soviet attempt to expand a foothold compelled the 17th Army to shift units, consume ammunition, and call on Luftwaffe support. Each German counterattack, in turn, used up reserves that could not be replaced at the same rate, given the growing strain on sea supply and the diminishing prospects of reinforcement by land. Weather amplified the crisis. Storms over the Black Sea disrupted convoys from Romanian ports and reduced the number of days when ships could safely dock at Sevastopol or Feodosia. Ice and mud on the roads inside Crimea slowed movement of fuel and food toward front sectors. On some days, coastal traffic was interrupted entirely, forcing quartermasters to cut rations or delay ammunition deliveries to units engaged near Kerch or the Sivash. For frontline soldiers, this translated into longer intervals between hot meals, shortages of winter clothing in certain battalions, and the need to conserve artillery shells for targets considered absolutely essential. The land connection to the Ukrainian mainland deteriorated further. As Soviet forces advanced through southern Ukraine and approached the lower Dnieper and the Black Sea coast, German formations north of Crimea shortened their lines and abandoned positions that had covered the isthmus from the rear. When these units withdrew, engineer detachments implemented demolition plans along the approaches to Perekop and Chongar. Bridges over canals and small rivers were blown, sections of track were lifted or destroyed, and stretches of the old fortified zones were rendered unusable by explosive charges. By the end of 1943, heavy land traffic into Crimea had been reduced to a minimum, and the remaining road and rail links were damaged to a degree that would require major reconstruction for any later large-scale withdrawal in the opposite direction. Inside the peninsula, This shift altered the daily routine of military and civilian populations. Sevastopol, Simferopol, and other hubs became more dependent on convoys from the Western Black Sea. Storage depots were reorganized to prioritize fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies for combat units, while civilian consumption was further restricted. Local residents faced tighter rationing and increased requisitioning of livestock and agricultural produce. Labor details, including both local civilians and prisoners of war, were used to repair airfields, maintain coastal batteries, and build new field positions inland to compensate for the loss of prepared fortifications at the outer perimeter. Command relations showed increasing signs of strain. Reports from the 17th Army highlighted the risk of relying almost entirely on sea supply and pointed to the diminishing capacity of Perekop and Chongar as functioning transport corridors after repeated demolitions. Requests were made for permission to evacuate certain rear services or non-essential units early in order to reduce the overall burden on logistics. Higher headquarters, however, continued to emphasize the political and strategic importance of holding Crimea. Orders from Berlin and from Army Group A reiterated that the peninsula was to be defended and that any discussion of withdrawal must be framed in terms of limited local adjustments rather than a general evacuation plan. On the Soviet side, the winter months were used to stabilize and strengthen the existing footholds while preparing for a larger offensive. Units holding the Kerch bridgeheads dug deeper trench systems, brought in additional artillery and anti-tank guns when weather permitted, and improved communications with the Taman and Caucasus rear areas. Across the Sivash, engineer troops consolidated narrow strips of captured shoreline into more durable bridgeheads by laying log roads over mud, building corduroy tracks, and emplacing light artillery on makeshift platforms. These efforts were costly in manpower and material, but they ensured that the Soviet presence near Crimea's eastern and northern edges would persist through winter. For individual soldiers and officers on both sides, the nature of the crisis was perceived differently depending on position. German infantrymen on the Kerch Peninsula or along the Sivash saw an enemy that was tenacious but still held at bay, and they were aware only in outline of the broader logistical constraints. Naval personnel and dock workers in Sevastopol and other ports, by contrast, experienced the growing vulnerability of sea routes directly, measuring delays, accidents, and losses. Soviet assault troops in the bridgeheads confronted the immediate effects of German demolitions and terrain, often advancing over shattered or flooded ground, while staff officers at the 4th Ukrainian Front calculated how much additional force would be needed to overcome Crimea's multi-line defense. By early 1944, the cumulative effect of these developments was clear in planning documents, even if it was less visible in daily communiques. Crimea had evolved from a forward base with multiple lines of communication into a heavily garrisoned enclave whose land exit routes were damaged or largely unusable, and whose sea supply was exposed to weather and enemy action. The demolition of infrastructure at Perekop and along the approaches, undertaken to deny the Red Army ready use of the Crimean bridge, now formed part of a wider pattern in which every step taken to strengthen immediate defence increased the complexity of any future decision to withdraw the 17th Army by land. The peak of the Crimean campaign began on April 8, 1944, when the 4th Ukrainian Front opened its general offensive. Soviet forces, including the 2nd Guards Army, 51st Army, and units of the separate Coastal Army, attacked simultaneously from the Sivash bridgeheads and the Perekop direction, while formations on the Kerch Peninsula advanced westward. In total, Soviet strength committed to the operation exceeded 450,000 personnel, supported by several thousand guns and mortars and more than 500 tanks and self-propelled guns. Opposing them, the German 17th Army and its Romanian contingents fielded roughly 200,000 troops with limited armoured reserves and a defensive system already weakened by earlier demolitions and supply problems. At Perekop, The offensive revealed the dual effect of the previous German engineering policy. The demolished and partly flooded outer works slowed Soviet infantry and vehicles, forcing them to deploy engineers and assault units to create new approaches under fire. Minefields and artillery from German positions behind the broken fortifications inflicted casualties and delayed advances. At the same time, the absence of continuous, intact defensive belts deprived German units of depth and prepared fallback lines. Once Soviet troops breached local strongpoints, there were fewer secondary positions to which German companies and battalions could retire in an organized sequence. Across the Sivash, Soviet attacks targeted the narrow causeways and low ground held by elements of German infantry and security units. Assault groups moved along corduroy roads and improvised bridges laid over mud and shallow water, supported by concentrated artillery fire. German forces attempted to counterattack, but found that the terrain they had partially destroyed now constrained their own movement as much as the enemy's. Vehicles bogged down, and some routes marked on older maps no longer existed in usable form. The result was a series of positional collapses rather than a single continuous withdrawal. On the Kerch Peninsula, Soviet armies pressed west from their winter bridgeheads. They deployed combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, armour, and close air support. German and Romanian divisions, already reduced by months of fighting, defended villages and ridgelines, but lacked the reserves to seal every penetration. As Soviet units captured road junctions and local heights, the entire eastern defence zone of Crimea began to bend. The 17th Army now faced converging Soviet advances from east and north, linked by artillery and airstrikes on key hubs such as Jankoy and Simferopol. High command decisions during these weeks reflected mounting pressure. Reports from 17th Army headquarters described heavy Soviet artillery concentrations, growing shortages of fuel and ammunition, and difficulties in moving units between threatened sectors. Requests for authorization to conduct a timely partial evacuation by sea, at least of non-essential personnel and heavy equipment, were renewed. Hitler and the OKH, however, continued to insist that the peninsula be held and that Sevastopol serve as a fortress to delay the Soviet advance into the western Black Sea region. Orders emphasized counterattacks and holding key lines rather than a systematic retreat toward embarkation points. Civilian conditions deteriorated rapidly under the impact of the offensive. Towns and villages along the main axes of advance were subjected to artillery and air bombardment, followed by house-to-house fighting or rapid passage of front lines. German occupation authorities organized evacuation columns for certain administrative staff and families connected to the military, but many local residents lacked transport. Roads leading to Sevastopol and other ports became crowded with military vehicles, supply carts, and civilian wagons, all moving over infrastructure already damaged by earlier demolitions and now strained by constant traffic. As Soviet breakthroughs widened, the operational map of Crimea changed within days. By mid-April, Soviet units had captured Simferopol and were pushing towards Sevastopol and the southwestern coast. The Perekop and Sivash sectors, which had once been considered potential final barriers, were now behind the main Soviet lines. German formations that might previously have used these corridors for an orderly land withdrawal found that they were cut off from them by the speed and depth of the Soviet advance. The only remaining large-scale exit routes lay through ports still in Axis hands. For soldiers on the ground, the Crimean bridge disaster was not experienced as a single moment, but as an accumulation of blocked roads, missing bridges, and orders to hold positions that no longer connected to a coherent retreat plan. German infantry companies falling back from forward sectors discovered that some of the bridges and causeways they had once crossed were gone, and that new Soviet lines now lay between them and Perekop. Soviet troops, advancing through these same zones, saw evidence of earlier demolitions that had briefly delayed their progress, but had also removed structures that could have been used by retreating Axis forces. By the end of April 1944, The peak phase of the campaign had thus produced a clear result. Soviet forces controlled most of the peninsula and had compressed the 17th Army into a shrinking coastal strip around Sevastopol and a few remaining ports. The land routes that might once have allowed a substantial portion of the German and Romanian troops to leave Crimea were either in enemy hands or rendered unusable on the scale required. The focus shifted decisively to the question of what could still be evacuated by sea, and under what conditions, from a position where the earlier destruction of the Perekop Bridge had already turned the peninsula into a de facto island. As Soviet forces drove deeper into Crimea during late April 1944, both sides entered a phase in which resistance and adaptation were shaped less by plans drawn months earlier and more by improvisation in a rapidly changing environment. For the German 17th Army and its Romanian contingents, the principal tasks were to stabilize a defensive perimeter around Sevastopol and a few secondary ports, to slow the Soviet advance long enough to organize sea lift, and to maintain cohesion among units that had been forced into successive withdrawals. For the Soviet 4th Ukrainian Front and Black Sea Fleet, the focus shifted to tightening the ring, neutralizing remaining coastal batteries, and disrupting any attempt to evacuate large numbers of Axis troops across the sea. Around Sevastopol, German and Romanian engineers reactivated and modified older fortifications dating back to previous wars and to the 1941 to 1942 siege. Positions on hills and capes overlooking the approaches to the city were reinforced with fieldworks, anti-tank obstacles, and improvised strongpoints in stone buildings. Heavy coastal guns, originally intended to fire on ships, were turned inland where possible to provide long-range artillery support against Soviet columns. Infantry units reorganized into battle groups, combining remnants of several divisions with what remained of artillery and anti-aircraft units. This structure was designed to compensate for gaps in manpower and equipment by concentrating available firepower at key points. Adaptation also took place at sea. Kriegsmarine and Romanian naval staffs reallocated transport and escort vessels operating in the western Black Sea, redirecting them toward Crimea. Freighters, ferries, and smaller craft were pressed into service to move personnel and equipment from Sevastopol, Yevpatoria, and smaller harbours. Some ships that had previously delivered supplies now sailed in reverse, loaded with wounded, specialists, and selected rear units. Makeshift embarkation points were established using damaged piers and new wooden jetties constructed by naval engineers and harbour workers. Night sailings were preferred to reduce exposure to Soviet air attack, requiring careful coordination of convoys and coastal navigation lights. Soviet forces adapted in parallel. The Black Sea Fleet increased patrols and mining operations along likely evacuation routes, while air units based at newly captured airfields inside Crimea and on the Caucasus coast targeted ports and shipping lanes. Bomber and attack aircraft focused on transport vessels, tankers, and harbour facilities, attempting to reduce the carrying capacity available to the enemy. Artillery units were brought forward to positions from which they could fire on Sevastopol's outer defences and, in some cases, on harbour installations themselves. Assault groups trained in storming field fortifications were now prepared for urban combat in and around the city. Resource management became a central concern. German quartermasters in Sevastopol drew up lists of priority categories for evacuation: wounded capable of further service, technical personnel, staff officers, and specialized units that could be redeployed elsewhere. Heavy equipment such as artillery pieces and vehicles competed for cargo space with human passengers. As the Soviet advance continued, decisions were made to destroy equipment that could not be moved in time. Stocks of ammunition and fuel were redistributed to frontline units expected to hold sectors during the final phase, accepting that some depots near the ports might have to be abandoned at short notice. For Soviet commanders, The need to maintain operational tempo while avoiding excessive losses in assaults on strong positions required careful balancing. Rather than attacking every defensive point immediately, they used reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations to identify weak sectors and to time attacks to coincide with artillery preparation and airstrikes. Infantry units rotated through forward positions to limit exhaustion, while engineers constructed new roads and improved existing ones to move guns and supplies closer to the front. Medical services were expanded in captured towns to handle growing numbers of wounded as operations approached Sevastopol's defensive ring. Morale on both sides underwent significant fluctuations. Among German and Romanian troops, the knowledge that Perekop and other land exits were no longer available as retreat routes reinforced the perception that survival depended on holding long enough to reach a place on a ship. Reports mention instances of discipline problems and unauthorized attempts to reach ports independently, but they also record organized resistance in strongpoints where units held positions in accordance with orders until overrun or encircled. In Soviet ranks, the prospect of completing the liberation of Crimea motivated many soldiers, yet the difficulty of assaults against well-sited defenses and the visible destruction in towns and villages reminded them of the costs still to come. Civilians adapted as best they could to a situation in which front lines, evacuation movements, and bombardments crossed the same space within days. Some inhabitants of coastal areas sought places on departing ships, while others remained in their homes or shelters, lacking transport or anticipating that the fighting would pass quickly. Those staying behind encountered successive authorities as German military units withdrew. Local administrative structures collapsed, and Soviet troops entered. For them, the bridge disaster meant not only the closure of the land route out of Crimea, but also the sudden reorientation of daily life around access to food, water, and shelter in a contested zone. By early May 1944, the pattern of resistance and adaptation was clear. German and Romanian forces were compressed into a shrinking enclave around Sevastopol, continuing to fortify positions and organize embarkations under increasing fire. Soviet armies and naval forces adjusted their tactics to limit the scale of any evacuation and to prepare for final assaults on key strongpoints. The earlier destruction of the Perekop fortifications and transport links, originally intended to control the timing and direction of Soviet advances, had by this stage irrevocably shaped the options available to both attacker and defender in the closing stage of the campaign. The turning point of the Crimean campaign came in the first half of May 1944, when the gap between what German high command orders demanded and what the 17th Army could physically achieve became impossible to bridge. Soviet forces had already taken most of the peninsula. Their artillery now reached Sevastopol's outskirts and key road junctions, while air units attacked ships entering and leaving the harbour. Every additional day of resistance allowed some men to be evacuated by sea, but it also reduced the time and space available for an organised withdrawal of the remaining forces. Within this narrowing interval, a sequence of decisions fixed the final outcome. As Soviet formations closed in from the north and east, 17th Army Headquarters renewed its requests to conduct a large-scale evacuation. Staff calculations suggested that, given available shipping tonnage, weather conditions, and enemy air and naval activity, only a limited number of personnel could be removed in the remaining days. Estimates varied, but even in optimistic scenarios, perhaps half of the approximately 200,000 German and Romanian troops still in Crimea could hope to reach ports in Romania or Bulgaria. The remainder would have to continue fighting in shrinking defensive zones. Hitler's directives, transmitted through Army Group A and the OKH, maintained that Sevastopol should be defended as a fortress. The official instruction was to hold the city as long as possible, tying down Soviet forces and influencing the broader situation on the southern wing of the Eastern Front. Permission was granted to evacuate wounded, technical specialists, and selected units, but not to abandon the position wholesale. This decision effectively divided the 17th Army into two categories: those who had a realistic chance of embarking in time, and those who would remain in the fortress until its fall. On the Soviet side, command decisions aimed to convert operational success into final collapse. The 4th Ukrainian Front coordinated concentrated artillery bombardments and infantry assaults with Black Sea Fleet and air operations against Sevastopol and coastal shipping. Priority was given to capturing heights and gun positions that dominated the harbour approaches. As batteries fell and airfields were overrun, Soviet artillery and aircraft could fire with increasing precision on piers, anchorages, and exit channels. This reduced the number of ships that could safely approach and lengthened the turnaround time of each evacuation voyage. The pace of events accelerated in the second week of May. Soviet troops broke through outer defensive lines and entered suburbs and industrial zones. German and Romanian units withdrew to inner sectors, often under direct observation from Soviet forward observers. In these conditions, moving large columns to the port for embarkation became increasingly difficult. Some transports departed under fire, taking on board several thousand men at a time. Others were damaged or sunk before loading was complete. Each lost ship represented not only casualties, but also a reduction in future carrying capacity. For the individuals involved, the turning point was experienced in different ways. Officers in 17th Army headquarters and in Sevastopol's port command watched daily tallies of evacuated personnel and compared them to the numbers still in the fortress, recognizing that the gap could no longer be closed. Naval crews and harbour workers faced the immediate risk of air and artillery attack while attempting to maintain schedules. Frontline soldiers, ordered to hold lines that had become directly linked to the safety of embarkation routes, saw that each new Soviet breakthrough shortened the time during which any withdrawal remained possible. Soviet commanders and staff perceived the same moment from the opposite angle. Reports from frontline units indicated growing disorganization in some enemy sectors, increased numbers of prisoners, and instances of abandoned equipment near roads leading to the port. Interrogations of captured soldiers confirmed that evacuation was underway, but also that many units had received orders to stay. These indicators suggested that a decisive collapse of organized resistance might occur if pressure was maintained on key strongpoints and communication nodes. By mid-May, the cumulative effect of all preceding demolitions, withdrawals, and command decisions became irreversible. The land corridors that once connected Crimea to the mainland could no longer serve any role in extricating large formations. They existed only as historical lines on maps. The sea routes, constrained by port capacity and enemy action, had evacuated a significant number of troops, on the order of 120,000 to 130,000 men, but left tens of thousands still in Sevastopol and nearby positions. The strategic turning point lay in the realization, shared in different forms by both sides, that the defense of the fortress no longer protected an escape route in any meaningful sense. It marked the transition from a campaign about maneuver and delay to an outcome defined by encirclement, capture, and the final surrender or destruction of the remaining Axis forces in Crimea. The end of combat operations in Crimea unfolded over a few days rather than a single moment. In early May 1944, Soviet attacks broke through the last defensive belts around Sevastopol. On May 9th, assault troops entered the city's central districts and key high ground, while other formations pushed toward the Chersonese promontory, where elements of German and Romanian units were attempting to form a final perimeter. Coastal batteries, already under concentrated artillery and air bombardment, were either captured or destroyed by their crews. The harbour area lay under direct fire. Ships at anchor or approaching the port did so in full view of Soviet observers. Attempts to continue evacuation during these final days met with sharply reduced results. Some transport and warships managed to take on board contingents of wounded and selected units departing under air attack and artillery fire. Others were sunk or damaged in and near the harbour, leaving hundreds of men in the water. The volume of personnel that could be removed declined with each day as port facilities were damaged, approaches came under closer fire, and the defensive ring contracted. Operationally, the moment when embarkation ceased to be possible for most units was reached before the last organised resistance ended on land. By 12th May, the main organised defence on the Chersonese peninsula collapsed. Groups of German and Romanian soldiers attempted to break out along the coastline or to reach remaining boats, but Soviet infantry and armour closed in from several directions. Many small groups were overrun or surrendered when ammunition ran out. Soviet reports recorded the capture of tens of thousands of prisoners in the final days, including command personnel from several divisions and corps. Overall, Soviet sources claimed more than 60,000 Axis troops taken prisoner in the concluding phase of the Crimean operation, while German records indicate that approximately 120,000 to 130,000 men had been evacuated by sea over the preceding months, and that several tens of thousands had been killed or were missing. For the captured German and Romanian soldiers, the withdrawal phase turned into the beginning of captivity. Columns of POWs were assembled on open ground near Sevastopol and along the routes inland. From there, they were sent under guard to collection points and then to camps in the rear. Officers and technical specialists were separated for interrogation. Conditions during the first days were shaped by the rapid pace of events and limited resources. Water and food distribution could not always keep up with the numbers held, and medical services were stretched by the parallel task of treating Soviet wounded. Over time, prisoners were redistributed into larger camps deeper inside Soviet territory, where their experiences diverged according to nationality, rank, and health. Romania experienced the outcome in a distinct way. Its army had contributed mountain and infantry units to the Crimean garrison and had suffered significant losses in the final battles and in captivity. The fall of Crimea and the partial destruction of Romanian formations weakened Bucharest's military position and its confidence in German strategic decisions. At the same time, Romanian ports such as Constanta had served as destinations for evacuated troops, bringing back officers and soldiers whose accounts of the campaign, the failed evacuation, and the closure of the land route through Pericop influenced discussions within the Romanian political and military leadership in the months before the change of alignment in August 1944. On the Soviet side, the immediate aftermath involved both military consolidation and administrative re-establishment. The Fourth Ukrainian Front reorganized its forces, rotated units out of combat, and began clearing operations against remaining pockets of resistance and unexploded ordnance. Engineer troops worked to restore damaged roads and rail lines, repair bridges, and inspect the heavily altered defensive zones at Pericop and along the Sivash. Naval and air units surveyed ports and sea approaches for wrecks and mines, reopening selected routes for Soviet shipping. Sevastopol's harbour, though heavily damaged, was quickly earmarked for reconstruction as a base for the Black Sea Fleet. For civilians in Crimea, the end of fighting meant a rapid transition between authorities. German military and occupation structures disappeared within days, replaced by Soviet military commandantias and, soon after, by NKVD and civilian administration organs. Arrests of persons suspected of collaboration began, based on precompiled lists and local denunciations. At the same time, broader security and demographic measures were planned and implemented. One of the most consequential was the decision, taken shortly after the military operation, to deport the Crimean Tatar population on the grounds of alleged collective collaboration with the occupiers. In May 1944, NKVD units organised the removal of most Crimean Tatars to Central Asia, fundamentally altering the peninsula's ethnic composition and adding a further dimension to the human cost of the campaign and occupation. In the narrow area of Pericop and its approaches, the immediate post-campaign landscape bore the traces of decisions made months earlier. demolished fortifications, destroyed bridges, and abandoned construction material testified to the systematic effort to convert the isthmus into an obstacle zone. For Soviet engineers, these features existed primarily as problems to be cleared or rebuilt in order to restore normal communications. For German officers writing reports after captivity, the same terrain became evidence in their reconstruction of how the Crimean bridge had ceased to function as a viable exit route. Some argued that an earlier land-based withdrawal, while Soviet forces were still east of the lower Dnieper, could have extricated a larger portion of the 17th Army. Others stressed that political instructions and the priority given to holding Crimea had made such options theoretical only. By the time organized resistance ended, the peninsula had effectively shifted from a contested forward position to a rear area of the Soviet war effort. Yet the immediate aftermath remained marked by the legacy of the retreat and the demolitions that had accompanied it. Ports were clogged with wrecks, hills and fields were scarred by minefields and craters, and large prisoner columns and displaced civilians moved through spaces that had once been defined on German maps as parts of a controlled, fortified Crimean bridgehead. The operational question of whether the destruction of Perekop's defences had been a tactical success or a strategic trap gave way, in this phase, to the practical tasks of clearing, rebuilding, and redistributing forces and populations in a region whose infrastructure and social fabric had been reshaped by the decisions taken during the retreat. In the longer perspective of the war, the Crimean campaign and the destruction of the Perekop fortifications became a case study in how tactical engineering decisions interact with strategic choices at the highest level. On the German side, post-war analyses by former officers of the 17th Army and Army Group A frequently emphasized that the demolitions around Perekop and the northern approaches achieved their immediate purpose. They complicated Soviet operations in late 1943 and early 1944, forced the Red Army to invest engineer resources, and contributed to the delay of a direct breakthrough into Crimea by several months. In this sense, the Crimean bridge functioned as a temporary obstacle system whose destruction yielded measurable gains in time. At the same time, those same reports acknowledged that the structural outcome of these measures, together with Hitler's refusal to authorize an early withdrawal, was to convert Crimea into a large coastal pocket, dependent almost entirely on sea supply. When compared with operations elsewhere on the Eastern Front, the peninsula resembled an enlarged version of other encircled or semi-encircled groups, such as the formations trapped on Baltic or Curonian bridgeheads later in the war. The difference was that, in Crimea, the land exit through Perekop had been deliberately reduced as a functioning corridor long before the final Soviet offensive began. This fact underpinned the argument of those who later described the operation as a strategic trap of the Wehrmacht's own making. From the Soviet perspective, contemporary and later historiography tended to focus less on the engineering decisions at Perekop and more on the success of the 1944 Crimean offensive as part of a sequence of operations that included the Dnieper crossings and subsequent advances into Ukraine and the Balkans. Official accounts highlighted the coordination between the 4th Ukrainian Front and the Black Sea Fleet, the destruction or capture of the 17th Army, and the liberation of Sevastopol. The difficulties posed by the demolished fortifications and transport links at Perekop and the Sivash were acknowledged in operational studies, particularly in discussions of engineer tactics, but they did not become the central narrative theme. For Soviet authors, the key conclusion lay in the demonstration that converging land and sea offensives could overcome a heavily garrisoned peninsula even when the defender had prepared obstacles on the mainland approach. Romanian interpretations incorporated both military and political dimensions. Losses suffered by Romanian divisions in Crimea, combined with the experience of serving in a theatre where strategic decisions were ultimately made in Berlin, contributed to later debates in Bucharest about the costs and benefits of alliance with Germany. The evacuation of some Romanian troops by sea and the capture of many others in the final phase illustrated the asymmetry between German and Romanian capacities to influence timing and scale of withdrawals. In this context, the blocked land route through Perekop and the dependence on limited shipping space appeared not only as a military problem, but also as a symbol of constrained political agency. For the populations of Crimea, the legacy of the campaign was registered in demographic and social terms. The deportation of Crimean Tatars in May 1944, the arrival of returning Soviet citizens and new settlers, and the reconstruction of Sevastopol and other cities under Soviet administration reshaped the peninsula over the following years. The traces of the Crimean bridge disaster at Perekop and along the Sivash persisted in local memory more as physical scars, cratered fields, remnants of bunkers and rebuilt bridges, than as an abstract operational concept. The wartime transformation of the isthmus into a zone of demolitions and obstacles was gradually overwritten by new roads, canals, and post-war fortifications aligned with Cold War priorities. In military studies, the case of Crimea entered discussions on the employment of fortified regions and the risks of maintaining large forces on peninsulas or coastal salients. Analysts compared the German decision to hold the 17th Army in Crimea with other situations where mobile withdrawal might have preserved formations for later use. The figures were clear. Of roughly 230,000 Axis personnel in the peninsula at the beginning of 1944, around 120,000 to 130,000 were evacuated by sea, while more than 60,000 were taken prisoner and tens of thousands were killed. These numbers illustrated that, even with intense use of maritime transport, the capacity to remove troops from an exposed position was limited once land routes had been compromised or destroyed. Historical debates about whether the destruction of the Perekop fortifications was a tactical success or a strategic mistake therefore tend to distinguish between level and time frame. At the local level, in late 1943, demolitions and obstacles helped German units to manage retreats under pressure and forced the Red Army to absorb additional delays and losses in difficult terrain. At the operational and strategic level, when combined with decisions to hold Crimea as a fortress and to defer evacuation, the same measures contributed to sealing the 17th Army into a position from which only a fraction of its manpower and equipment could be extracted. In that sense, the bridge was destroyed not only in the physical sense, but also as an option in the planning of future maneuvers. In the broader history of the Eastern Front, the Crimean campaign highlights a recurring pattern in which command expectations and logistical realities diverged. The peninsula's fate was shaped by the interaction of geography, engineering, shipping capacity, and high-level political directives. For all parties involved, German, Romanian, Soviet, and the various civilian communities of Crimea, the consequences were measured in more than maps and staff tables, in the loss of units that could no longer be redeployed, in years spent in captivity, in forced migrations, and in the long-term reconstruction of cities and infrastructure. The Crimean bridge disaster thus occupies a specific place in the war's chronology, linking the tactical logic of fortifying and destroying an isthmus with the strategic question of how armies, states, and societies manage the transition from advance to retreat when the only remaining routes of escape are the ones they have partly removed themselves.